The spring of 1683 was a little later than usual, but it did not dampen the ambitions of Mohammed IV of the Ottoman Sultan. The monarch of the most powerful empire in the East reviewed the mighty army under his command. His soldiers were a fright to the infidels of Europe. They were stronger and braver than the Sultan's warriors of 150 years earlier. The majesty of Mohammed IV had already penetrated Europe. The whole of the Balkans, Hungary, Transylvania, and Wallachia was under his feet, and the road before him led to Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. He will finish what Suleiman I failed to do, and pick this golden apple. The doors of Christendom would then be opened to him, another peak of the empire after the capture of Constantinople. Mohammed IV could not help but smile at the thought. Kara Mustafa, the chancellor of the empire, led the march on behalf of Sudan. He looked ahead with great pride at the magnificent army. His army consisted of 300,000 men, but they were brave enough to destroy the weak European armies. In the vanguard were the cunning and agile Tartar cavalry, and in the main were countless Ottoman cavalry and smoothbore gunners. Surrounding him were the best Praetorian soldiers. Behind him was a battery of artillery and an unseen support wagon train. News of the Turkish advance soon reached the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, and Emperor Leopold was horrified that the Turks had reneged on a contract that he believed had kept the peace for nearly 20 years, and had entered the empire. The generals told the emperor that less than a few thousand soldiers were guarding the capital. The 32,000 imperial soldiers led by the Duke of Lorraine were outside the capital and could not be counted on. With the bad news that the Ottoman army had taken one by one town and fortress after another along the way, Leopold decided that he, the Empress, and the two sons would leave Vienna. You could accuse the emperor of not having the courage to die with his people, but Leopold had his own problems. The Habsburg royal family was not flourishing, and apart from him and his two sons, he was left with the unreliable King of Spain as a sidekick. Did the royal bloodline end at his hands? No. The emperor gave the responsibility of defending Vienna to General Starhemberg. When word spread that the royal family was fleeing Vienna, many noblemen and citizens followed, fleeing the most prosperous city in Europe. But this was not necessarily a bad thing, for those who remained were those who were determined to die, noblemen and citizens alike, and who would unite to meet their enemies. The emperor, despite his lack of courage, did take some responsibility, and the empire spent a great deal of money on the best fortress engineer in Europe, Lampel, to restore and improve as much as possible the fortifications of Vienna, which had a complex system of bastion that was made even more impregnable. Vienna also had over 300 cannons, more than the Turkish army. The Viennese had cut down all the trees outside the city, and an attack on the bastion without cover would have been suicide. General Starhemberg also organized all the men who could fight: the sheriffs, the armed citizens, the night watchmen, and the army to form a garrison of 15,000 men. In particular, the hunters and rangers from the countryside proved to be good snipers. The people of the city worked day and night to build fortifications. The Ottomans had finally arrived at Vienna, and they surrounded the city. Mustafa looked at the high spires of the cathedral and believed that the crescent flag would soon be planted on the churches. He ordered his army to rest for 10 days and prepare for an attack. The Turks erected a high earthen platform and placed artillery on it to bombard the city. Because of the long distances involved in transporting the huge and heavy siege guns, the Ottoman army had only about 150 field guns. cannons, and some light molars. These guns were unable to destroy the Viennese fortress. But the Ottomans, already experienced in dealing with these new forts, dug in and soon pushed forward in front of the bastion. And a bloody close battle broke out. Grenades, smoothbore guns, and bows were fired at each other from a distance of a few meters, and even spears were exchanged across the wooden fence. The Turks suffered heavy losses as the defenders took advantage of the high ground. In the face of artillery fire, the Turks built earth platforms in front of the fortress fences, from which the smoothbore gunners fired against the Viennese defenders. The field guns were brought to the front of the line to bombard the defenders behind the fences, and the Praetorians tried desperately to clear the way with grenades. After 10 days of attacks, and the loss of thousands of Ottomans, the first line of defense was finally broken through. The Turks soon discovered that behind the fence were even more difficult bastions, which were so close together and supported each other that they were difficult to approach, and even more difficult to climb. The Turks changed their tactics. In addition to continuing to dig trenches, sent out engineers to dig tunnels underneath the fortresses, and placed large mines to blow them down. These tactics had been developed over centuries of offensive and defensive warfare, and the men of Holy Rome knew the secrets. They used tunnels against tunnels, placed sounders, and dug through the Turkish tunnels according to their direction. On several occasions, the sappers of both sides dug through each other, but contrary to expectations, instead of a fierce battle, the soldiers of both sides slowly retreated from each other, fearing that if they fought in these unsupported tunnels, they would collapse and bury everyone. Although the Viennese succeeded in locating the Turkish mines several times, the Turks also succeeded in setting them off several times, collapsing many gaps. The battle broke out in the gaps, and a mountain of dead bodies was piled up. General Stelenberg was not willing to be passive in his defense, and had his warriors organize expendables to carry out night attacks and counterattacks, which initially had good results, with many Turkish soldiers killed by the sudden counterattacks, and a large number of Turkish sappers suffocated in the tunnels. But the Turks were quick to respond by expendables, and ambushing them in the trenches throughout the night. So that General Starhemberg's squads were ambushed, and lost so many men that they were the bravest of the warriors. The general's men had shown great bravery, but to their despair, the Turks never seemed to be able to stop killing them. As time passed, the food in Vienna began to run out, and many people became too hungry to stand up. The wild cats in the city were eaten by the hungry citizens, and got the nickname, the rabbits on the roof, and then the rats were eaten clean. The fact that there was no plague in Vienna, a city full of feces, rubbish, and dead people, is probably one of the reasons. Many others began to try to flee, but all those caught fleeing were hanged. General Stelenberg sent out rockets every night, from the top of the highest church tower, hoping for a response from the reinforcements outside the city. But day after day, there was no response, and despair began to overwhelm everyone. Leopold and his ministers did not remain idle, and they tried to appeal to Christendom for help. Not surprisingly, the mighty French rejected the Habsburg appeal for help. Louis XIV was happy for the Holy Roman Empire to be destroyed by the Turks. He had a certain understanding of the Ottoman Empire. That was even an open secret in diplomatic circles. However, despite Louis XIV's strict prohibition on aiding the empire, many young noblemen with a passionate desire to make a name for themselves, including Prince Eugene, who would become a great general, secretly went to help. The German states, despite their religious conflicts with the Holy Roman Empire, did not want to see the Muslims penetrate their heartland, and the Duke of Saxony and Prince Frederick went with their best troops to relieve the siege, after the Holy Roman Emperor promised to compensate them with a large sum of money borrowed from the Vatican. King Sobieski of Poland, who had a contractual obligation to support Holy Rome, also went to Vienna with 30,000 Polish-Hungarian troops, after watching the situation. Mustafa was in a better position than inside the city. His men still had plenty of food, and although the camp was full of wounded soldiers, and many of his best men had been killed, Mustafa was still convinced that Vienna would soon fall to him. As the sappers continued to demolish sections of the defenses, the final wall was very close to being blown up, so it was inevitable that Allah's warriors would be victorious. The Tatar cavalry operating in the west sent word that an army of Christians was approaching Vienna, but Mustafa decided to focus on the immediate siege. As long as Vienna was taken, the rest of the enemy was nothing to fear. Besides, according to reconnaissance, his army was still outnumbered. So what was there to worry about? After much bargaining, the most numerous, King Sobieski of Poland, took command and was in charge of the right flank. The Poles decided to take their opponents by surprise by sending their cavalry over Mount Callum and setting up their artillery positions on Mount Callum to bombard the enemy from above. The Imperial Army and the elite infantry of the German alliance would attack the Ottoman army in the center and on the left flank first, to draw out the main fighting force. That night, the Duke of Lorraine sent a scouting team of dragoons across the Callan Mountains to investigate. A signal was sent to the Viennese garrison that reinforcements had arrived. As General Stalenberg's men were once again disheartened by the release of the rockets, they were surprised to find the same signal rocket rising from Mount Callum, and the city rejoiced that God's favor had finally come to Vienna. Mustafa divided his army into two parts, one to continue the assault in the hope of capturing Vienna as soon as possible, and the other, with nearly 100,000 men, to position themselves westwards to meet the Christian reinforcements. The two sides soon met in the plain, first with musketeers and archers shooting at each other, and soon soldiers with spears and scimitars began to fight in close quarters. Mustafa's intention was to overwhelm his opponents with a swift attack, so he did not order his soldiers to build field fortifications and roadblocks, for which he would soon suffer. As the battle between the center and the left was stagnant, the Polish artillery on Mount Callum began to fire, targeting the Turkish artillery positions. The Turks had deployed 60 cannons to support the battle, which had been favorable support for the center on the left. But the sudden blow put the Turkish artillery under pressure, after the Polish cannons were high up on the hill and had a geographical range advantage. At the foot of the hill, the famous Polish Hussars emerged from the trees and began to form upon the plain. 15,000 cavalrymen, including 5,000 of the best Polish Hussars, the rest Polish light cavalry. Against them were the Turkish infantry and the Tatar cavalry. The Polish king sent out a pair of 100 cavalries to test his opponent's lines. This company, bearing the name of the king's son Alexander, rushed to the dense enemy lines. The battle was witnessed by the historian Kachowski, who wrote that the Hussars lowered their spears and the Turks were impaled on them, an inescapable blow that terrified the enemy. These 100 warriors killed many of their enemies, but all of them were eventually killed on the battlefield. Their bravery shook the line, and the wily Tatars began to have second thoughts and fled from the battlefield. Sobieski took this opportunity and ordered a full charge. The 15,000 cavalrymen, with their horses raised, charged the enemy across the hills. It was one of the biggest cavalry charges in European history. The unprotected Turkish infantry lost all courage in the face of the thunderous attack, and many turned and fled, and no officer could stop the slaughtered soldiers. Mustafa, with his elite Praetorian Guard, intended to hold the line but was unable to do so. He had no choice but to flee backward with them in tow. The Turkish army in the middle and on the left quickly collapsed, trampling on each other and fleeing for their lives. While the defenders of the city, seeing this from their towers, began to organize a counterattack. Mustafa tried to gather his army and resist again, but the defeat of the Turkish army, both internally and externally, was already assured, and soon the last of the resistance was broken, and the whole army fled. During the battle, the Ottoman army lost over 20,000 men and thousands were taken prisoner. The Christian allies fought the Turks in Hungary and regained much of their lost territory. Mustafa escaped, but was hanged at Belgrade in the face of the Sultan's wrath. The centuries-old expansion of the Ottoman Empire was thus reversed, and in the next decade or so the Great Turkish War saw the expulsion of Ottomans from Hungary and Transylvania, and the subsequent rebellion saw Ottoman Islam pushed out of Europe by Christian forces. Poland achieved its greatest moment of glory when King Sobieski was hailed as the savior of Vienna. If history can be assumed, would the world have been a different place if the Ottomans had succeeded in capturing Vienna?